I stood silently in front of my parents' graves, my hand shaking as I clutched the $500.00 fine. They had been buried for 3 years, and the homeowner association had still issued a ticket for non-compliance with lawn mowing regulations. The cold way she said the rules are the rules made my chest tighten, not because of the pain of loss, but because of her arrogant stubbornness. She thought I would collapse and would stay silent, but she did not know at that moment I had decided that no one would trample on my parents' memory, and then I would launch the most costly counterattack of her life. I am David Miller, 28 years old, and I have just returned to Maple Ridge after burying my parents to sort through their possessions and decades of memories. The old 2-story house where I grew up sits quietly on Elm Street, its white picket fence now chipped, and its small yard overgrown with weeds. Margaret Stevens, 38 years old, with short, perfectly styled blonde hair, had come to our quiet neighborhood 5 years ago from some unknown big city, immediately positioning herself as the self-appointed guardian of property values and community standards. What she did not know, what no one in Maple Ridge knew, was what I had done before the psychological warfare began. Exactly 24 hours after my parents' funeral, when Margaret appeared at my front door clutching an official-looking clipboard and wearing that signature white shirt pressed to perfection. "I am terribly sorry for your loss, David," she said with practiced sympathy, "but I am afraid the property has already accumulated several violations." She handed me a $200 fine for weeds that had grown beyond the mysterious 6-inch regulation I had never heard of in 28 years of living here. "Mrs. Stevens, I just buried my parents yesterday," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I am still processing the estate. Could I possibly have some time to address these issues?" Her expression shifted from fake sympathy to businesslike coldness in an instant. "Regulations are regulations, Mr. Miller. Grief does not exempt anyone from community standards. You have exactly 72 hours. The way she emphasized exactly while adjusting her clipboard told me this was not about property maintenance at all. Margaret returned 3 days later with reinforcements, this time accompanied by a man she introduced as Homeowner Association Compliance Officer Jenkins, though he looked more like hired muscle than any official I had ever met. She presented me with a $350 fine for improper trash bin placement and failure to maintain curb appeal standards. When I pointed out that our bins had occupied the same spot beside the garage for 2 decades, Margaret produced a freshly printed regulation book that still smelled like printer toner. Of last month, all refuse containers must be positioned no less than 15 feet from the street and no more than 3 feet from the residence, she read mechanically. "You were not present at the community meeting where this was voted on, so naturally, you would not be aware of the changes." I noticed she kept glancing at her phone and checking the time, but she had somewhere more important to be. Mrs. Peterson, from next door, had mentioned something about Margaret's husband being a prominent lawyer in the city, though in 5 years, nobody had ever actually seen this mysterious spouse. The public humiliation campaign launched the following week, when Margaret organized what she called an emergency community standards meeting, right there on my front lawn. She had invited the entire neighborhood to witness what she dramatically termed a textbook example of how property neglect affects everyone's home values. About 20 neighbors gathered on the sidewalk, while Margaret, resplendent in her crisp white shirt and armed with a megaphone she had somehow procured, delivered a speech about community responsibility and property maintenance obligations. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, gesturing toward my house like a prosecutor presenting evidence, "this is precisely what happens when residents choose to disregard the community standards that protect all of our investments." She read from her clipboard a detailed list of my supposed infractions, from grass height to mailbox positioning to the color of my garden hose. Mrs. Peterson looked mortified, Mr. Martinez shook his head in disgust, but several newer residents nodded along with Margaret's performance. I stood in my doorway, feeling the weight of judgment from people who had known my family for decades, but Margaret's masterstroke came when she handed me that $500 citation addressed directly to my deceased parents, John and Mary Miller. "Failure to maintain landscaping standards, as required by Homeowner Association Regulation Section 4.7, she read aloud, for the entire gathering to hear. "But they have been dead for 3 years, I said, my voice cracking with a mixture. Margaret did not even blink. According to property law, The estate remains responsible for all violations until title transfer is complete. As the heir, you bear full legal responsibility for their compliance failures. That evening, I started digging into homeowner association records and discovered something that made my federal investigator instincts start tingling. Margaret had modified the community regulations 6 times in just the past 2 months, each change coincidentally creating new violations for properties she seemed to be targeting. None of these modifications had gone through proper voting procedures, and several directly contradicted the original homeowner association charter that had governed our neighborhood for 30 years. The isolation campaign began with a neighborhood-wide letter that Margaret personally delivered to every mailbox on Elm Street. Dear residents, it began, recent events have demonstrated that certain community members choose to disregard the standards that maintain our property values and neighborhood quality. Please consider carefully before engaging with households that consistently violate community regulations. Within days, neighbors who had brought casseroles to my parents' funeral were crossing the street to avoid making eye contact. People who had known me since I was 5 years old suddenly found urgent reasons to end conversations when I approached. The loneliness was suffocating, exactly as Margaret had calculated. She had weaponized my grief and turned my childhood neighborhood into a hostile environment where I felt like an unwelcome stranger, but she had made one critical error in her psychological warfare. She had assumed I was just another grieving son who would roll over and accept her authority. She had no idea she was dealing with someone who had spent 15 years investigating federal workplace violations and taking down corrupt officials who thought they were untouchable. Margaret's legal intimidation phase launched when she arrived with a man in an expensive dark suit who she introduced as our legal counsel, Mr. Harrison. They threatened a $5,000 lawsuit and forced sale of my property if I did not immediately comply with all homeowner association demands. Who exactly do you think you are to challenge duly constituted community authority? Margaret demanded, her voice rising with apparent righteous indignation. But when I asked to see Mr. Harrison's bar certification and legal authorization to represent the homeowner association, both of them exchanged nervous glances, and the supposed lawyer hurried away without another word. That night, I received a phone call that changed everything. David, this is Special Agent Rodriguez from the regional office, the familiar voice said. We have received multiple complaints about a homeowner association in Maple Ridge violating federal housing laws. Given your background and local knowledge, headquarters wants you to handle the investigation. I smiled, watching through my kitchen window as Margaret measured my neighbor's garden with a ruler and notepad. She had no idea that her reign of terror was about to collide with 15 years of federal law enforcement experience. I began what appeared to be innocent research into community regulations, telling neighbors I was simply trying to understand my responsibilities as a new property owner. In reality, I was conducting the same type of systematic investigation I had used to expose corporate fraud and workplace violations throughout my federal career. My first discovery sent alarm bells ringing through my investigator instincts. Margaret had unilaterally increased homeowner association fees by 300% over 18 months, without conducting a single legitimate community vote. Every rate increase had been implemented through completely fraudulent documentation, with meeting minutes that claimed unanimous approval from homeowners who had never attended any such meetings. I interviewed 5 long-term residents who swore they had never received notices about fee increases, let alone voted to approve them. Margaret had been systematically looting the community fund while creating fake paper trails to cover her theft. Using home security as my cover story, I installed a comprehensive camera system that just happened to capture the common areas where Margaret conducted her violation inspections. Within a week, I had footage of her trespassing on 3 different properties without permission, photographing residents' backyards and measuring garden features with a tape measure to manufacture violations. During casual conversations with neighbors about understanding the community rules, I uncovered a pattern of systematic intimidation that revealed Margaret's true nature. 75-year-old Mrs. Peterson broke down crying when she told me how Margaret had threatened her with a lien against her house unless she paid $800 for unauthorized fence modifications that had been approved by the previous homeowner association administration 20 years earlier. She said I would lose my home if I did not pay immediately, Mrs. Peterson sobbed. I had lived here for 40 years and I was so scared I gave her my life savings without questioning it. Mr. Martinez revealed that Margaret had forced him to sign documents approving regulation changes under threat of foreclosure proceedings. She told me that refusing to sign would be considered a violation of my homeowner association membership agreement and grounds for forced sale, he explained. My breakthrough came when Mr. Martinez, who had served on the homeowner association board for 20 years, quietly approached me with a cardboard box full of original documents. I have been keeping these in my basement because something felt wrong, he whispered, glancing around nervously. Margaret said the old records were destroyed in a flood, but I saved copies of everything. The box contained the real homeowner association charter, legitimate meeting minutes, and financial records that painted a completely different picture of our community's governance. Comparing Margaret's current regulations with the original homeowner association charter revealed that she had systematically rewritten nearly every community rule to give herself unprecedented power over residents' daily lives. The original charter limited homeowner association authority to basic maintenance standards and common area management. Margaret's version gave her control over paint colors, landscaping choices, parking arrangements, and even the types of decorative items residents could display in their own yards. Through my federal network, I ran a comprehensive background check that shattered Margaret's carefully constructed identity. Margaret Stevens was not her real name. She was actually Margaret Williams, a convicted fraudster who had been sued by investors in California for operating an illegal Ponzi scheme. Court records showed she had fled the state while facing federal charges for securities fraud and identity theft. Her entire presence in Maple Ridge was an elaborate lie. The mysterious husband who supposedly worked as a big city lawyer, he did not exist. Margaret had created an entire fictional backstory to explain her expensive lifestyle and give credibility to her legal threats. She had been funding her comfortable life entirely through systematic theft from our community fund, living off money stolen from neighbors who trusted her to protect their property values. I decided to set a legal trap. Using my knowledge of federal housing regulations, I offered to pay a voluntary settlement of $1,000 to avoid prolonged legal proceedings and community disruption. Margaret practically salivated at what she saw as my capitulation, eagerly agreeing to a recorded phone conversation where she outlined exactly how she planned to continue expanding her authority over community members. Do not you pay this settlement, Mr. Miller, you will be acknowledging homeowner association authority over your property, she explained gleefully. That means any future violations will result in immediate fines without appeal options. I am also implementing a new monthly compliance fee for all residents to fund enhanced enforcement activities. She had no idea I was documenting every word of her extortion attempt for federal prosecutor. My final investigative breakthrough came when I examined property records at the county courthouse. My house had been built on federal land that was transferred to civilian ownership with special protective covenants still in effect. The homeowner association had absolutely no legal jurisdiction over my property, and any attempts to impose fees or regulations constituted federal law violations. Margaret had been unknowingly committing federal crimes every time she stepped onto my land. Digging deeper into my father's papers, I discovered he had been a military engineer who had deliberately chosen this property because of its special legal status. He had wanted to protect our family from exactly this type of community harassment, and his foresight was about to become Margaret's downfall. A handwritten note in his files read, "A federal covenant protections ensure no local authority can interfere with family property rights. Choose this house to guarantee David's future security." While preparing formal complaints to the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit and the Department of Housing and Urban Development about violations of the Fair Housing Act, I smiled, thinking about my father's incredible foresight. He protected us from beyond the grave, and I was about to use his gift to bring down a predator who had been terrorizing our entire community. When Margaret appeared at my door with official-looking papers, demanding $10,000 and my immediate departure from the neighborhood, I was completely prepared. Looking directly into her eyes, I said calmly, "Margaret Williams, I think we should discuss this at the next community meeting. I have some information the neighbors might find very interesting about your background and qualifications. For the first time since I had known her, genuine fear flickered across her face before she quickly composed herself and hurried away. Margaret organized what she grandly announced as a special community resolution meeting at the neighborhood community center, personally inviting all 150 households with official-looking notices that promised to permanently resolve ongoing property compliance issues. She arrived 20 minutes early, wearing a navy blue blazer over her signature white shirt, her blonde hair styled to perfection, clearly expecting this to be her moment of absolute triumph over the troublemaker who dared to challenge her authority. The community center filled with neighbors I had known my entire life, many looking uncomfortable but afraid to openly challenge Margaret's increasingly authoritarian control over daily life in our once peaceful neighborhood. She had strategically seated her supporters in the front rows while positioning herself behind a makeshift podium decorated with official-looking homeowner association documents and a small American flag that somehow made her seem even more manipulative. Ladies and gentlemen, Margaret began with theatrical gravity, we gather tonight to address a serious threat to our community's stability and property values. She gestured toward me, sitting in the back row. Mr. Miller has consistently violated community standards, refused to pay legitimate fines, and openly defied the authority that you, the residents, have entrusted to me as your elected representative. Margaret spent 15 minutes reading from her fabricated list of my supposed crimes against the community, building dramatic tension with each accusation: failure to maintain regulation grass height, improper mailbox positioning, unauthorized garden hose storage, non-compliant holiday decorations, and most seriously, aggressive confrontation of homeowner association officials attempting to perform their lawful duties. Her voice rose with practiced indignation as she delivered her devastating finale. Therefore, under the emergency powers granted to me by your homeowner association charter, I am imposing a final fine of $15,000 on the Miller property and requiring the immediate sale and vacation of said property within 30 days. The room erupted in shocked murmurs, some people applauding while others looked genuinely horrified. Mrs. Peterson burst into tears, crying out, "This is not right. David does not deserve this treatment." I stood up slowly, still wearing the same faded blue t-shirt I had worn to my parents' funeral, and the room gradually fell silent. Every eye in the community center focused on me as I walked calmly to the front of the room. "Thank you for that comprehensive presentation, President Stevens," I said clearly, "or perhaps I should use your real name, Margaret Williams." The silence became absolutely deafening. Before we proceed with any votes or decisions, I think the community deserves to know exactly who they have been trusting with their money and their property rights. I activated the portable projector I had quietly set up earlier, and the first slide appeared on the wall behind Margaret's improvised podium. I am David Miller, and for the past 15 years, I have worked as a senior federal labor inspector specializing in fraud investigation and corporate compliance violations. The room buzzed with surprised whispers as neighbors processed this revelation about the quiet guy they had watched grow up on Elm Street. Margaret's confident expression wavered slightly, but she quickly recovered her composure. "Mr. Miller's employment history has no bearing on legitimate community governance," she declared, but her voice carried a slight tremor that had not been there before. My first evidence slide displayed side-by-side comparisons of meeting minutes with forged signatures, compared to authentic samples from earlier homeowner association documents. Here we see 12 separate instances of document falsification, where unanimous community approval was claimed for meetings that never actually occurred. Gasps and angry murmurs rippled through the crowd as people recognized their own supposedly forged signatures on decisions they had never made. The second slide revealed detailed financial records, showing exactly where the missing $50,000 from the homeowner association fund had disappeared. Bank records indicate systematic withdrawal of community funds for personal expenses, including luxury travel, shopping, and lease payments for a vehicle not owned by the homeowner association. Margaret's face had gone completely pale. But she attempted to maintain her authority. "But are clearly fabricated documents presented by someone who is obviously mentally unstable from grief," she declared desperately. "Mr. Miller has been acting erratically since his parents' death, and now he is apparently creating false evidence to avoid paying legitimate fines. But her voice cracked on the word legitimate, and several people in the front row were shaking their heads in disgust. My third slide showed crystal clear security camera footage of Margaret trespassing on private property without permission, measuring residents' gardens, and photographing their personal belongings to manufacture violations. Federal law is very specific about privacy rights and illegal surveillance. I explained calmly, this footage shows systematic violation. The room exploded as people recognized their own properties in the footage and realized they had been illegally surveilled by someone they trusted to protect their interests. Mr. Martinez stood up and shouted, "She threatened to foreclose on my house if I did not sign fake meeting minutes." Mrs. Peterson found her voice through her tears. "She stole $800 from me for a fence that was perfectly legal. Most importantly," I continued, holding up my property deed and federal land covenant documentation, "my house sits on federal land that was transferred with permanent protective status. This homeowner association has never had any legal authority whatsoever over my property, and every fine, every threat, every attempt at regulation has been a federal crime." The crowd erupted in chaos as neighbors realized they had been watching an innocent man get systematically tortured by a career criminal who had been stealing their money while violating federal law. Margaret made a desperate attempt to restore order, shouting, "These are obvious lies. I demand immediate voting on the Miller resolution," but her time was up. The FBI agents I have been coordinating with were waiting outside and entered the community center on my subtle signal. "Margaret Williams, you are under arrest for fraud, document forgery, theft, and violation of the Fair Housing Act under federal law," Special Agent Rodriguez announced as handcuffs clicked around Margaret's wrists. Her perfectly styled blonde hair fell across her face as she struggled against the inevitable, her navy blazer wrinkled, and her authority completely evaporated. "This is illegal," she screamed. "I have community authorization, I am the elected president." But nobody was listening anymore as she was led away through a crowd of people she had been systematically robbing and intimidating. The community center erupted in thunderous applause that seemed to shake the building's foundation. Mr. Martinez called for immediate action. "We need legitimate leadership right now. I nominate David Miller for Emergency Homeowner Association President." 150 hands shot up in unanimous support, and for the first time in years, our neighborhood felt like a community again instead of a dictatorship. Margaret Williams received a federal sentence of 3 years in prison followed by 5 years of supervised probation for multiple counts of fraud, theft, and civil rights violations. The $50,000 she had stolen was completely recovered through asset forfeiture and returned to the community fund with interest. Federal law prohibited her from holding any position of authority in residential communities for the rest of her life, ensuring she could never again terrorize innocent families. As the newly elected Homeowner Association president, I immediately implemented comprehensive reforms designed to prevent any future abuse of community authority. Financial transparency became our absolute foundation, with detailed monthly reports of every penny collected and spent published online and mailed to every household. Democratic participation replaced dictatorship through a new charter requiring 2/3 community approval for any regulation changes, with mandatory 30-day notice periods and open debate sessions. We established an independent grievance committee composed of rotating community volunteers who could investigate complaints against homeowner association leadership and recommend corrective action. Most importantly, we eliminated 90% of Margaret's arbitrary regulations, keeping only those essential for genuine safety concerns and basic property maintenance that actually protected everyone's home values. Mrs. Peterson became our vice president with special responsibility for supporting elderly residents and families experiencing financial difficulties. Her first initiative was a community assistance fund that helped neighbors facing temporary hardships avoid losing their homes to minor maintenance issues. Mr. Martinez accepted the position of treasurer, implementing accounting practices that made every financial transaction visible to the entire community. Every family that had been illegally fined under Margaret's fraudulent regime received full refunds with interest calculated from the date of the original violation. The community fund, now properly managed and transparent, actually saved money by eliminating Margaret's personal expenses and fraudulent contractor payments. Property values increased as word spread about our reformed, resident-friendly community governance. I made the life-changing decision to resign from my federal position and establish permanent residence in Maple Ridge. My parents' house underwent loving restoration, with their small garden becoming a weekend gathering place where neighbors shared coffee, children played safely, and the community togetherness my parents had always loved was born again, stronger than ever. Using my federal law enforcement experience, I opened a free legal help center for local residents facing trouble from bad homeowner associations, greedy contractors, or other cheating scams targeting small neighborhoods. Within 6 months, I was helping families across 3 counties protect themselves from the kind of mistreatment Margaret had done to our neighborhood. We put up a bronze sign at the main entrance to our community that said, "Maple Ridge Neighborhood, where fairness and kindness are the most important," restarted in 2025 under rules of openness, respect, and group decision-making. The small garden my parents had lovingly taken care of bloomed more beautifully than ever, becoming a living sign of our community's new life and fresh start. The local newspaper wrote about our story with the headline, "Federal Inspector Finds Bad HOA and Changes the Community." Other neighborhoods facing the same problems started asking me to speak about fixing HOA rules and protecting people's rights. Our success story became a model for communities across the state dealing with bossy board members and money stealing. Every year, on the day my parents passed away, the entire neighborhood comes to their gravesite for a remembrance gathering that has become our most loved community tradition. We do not gather because they were my parents, but because they taught me that fairness might come late, but it never fails to arrive for those who fight for what is right and refuse to give up to bullies. I stood in my parents' fixed garden on a perfect spring morning, still wearing a blue t-shirt, but now surrounded by laughing children, chatting neighbors, and the peaceful community my parents had always dreamed of. Mrs. Peterson brought fresh cookies, Mr. Martinez shared stories and jokes, and families gathered for evening barbecues where everyone was welcome. On my desk, Margaret's final $500 fine addressed to my deceased parents sits in a simple frame, not as a trophy of victory, but as a forever reminder that sometimes people need a big shock to understand exactly what kind of world they are living in. And thanks to my parents' smart thinking, federal law, and a community that finally found its bravery, our world is much better than Margaret Williams ever thought possible.